Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining this roundtable on SCA delegation. My name's Alan Martin. I work for Thales, and I co-chair the FIDO Europe working group. And so within FIDO Europe, we've been working on this subject of SCA delegation in the past months, and we've produced and published a white paper on the subject. And so today, we'll be actually presenting the content of this paper briefly, and then we'll dive into a live discussion with our different panelists. And so with me, I'd like to welcome Jason Munsey from Amazon, Lee Goddard and Jonathan Folks from FIS, and Jonathan Grosar from MasterCard. Could you please actually, Jason, briefly introduce yourself, please?
Sure, thanks, Alan. My name is Jason Munsey. I represent consumer payments at Amazon.
Thank you, Jason. Lee?
Hi, I'm Lee Goddard. I'm a product director and the head of authentication product at FIS WorldPay.
Thank you very much. And Jonathan Folks, please.
I'm Jonathan Folks from FIS, and I'm looking at delegated authentication for product.
And finally, Jonathan Grosar from MasterCard.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Grosar from the Global Authentication team at MasterCard.
Thank you very much. And so before we dive into the discussion, Jonathan, the floor is yours to present the content of our white paper. Thank you.
Thanks, Alain. And hi, everyone. Welcome to this roundtable on delegated authentication. So we thought that I would take around 10 minutes to provide everyone on the call with an introduction to the authentication of consumers with delegated authentication. And in reality, this is a bigger objective, which is to improve the security of e-commerce transactions overall. So we have today more and more e-commerce transactions initiated by consumers from multiple devices like a PC, a tablet, a phone, but even a car or any other connected device. So it is critical that we secure the payment credentials that are provided to merchants during online transactions. This is not only to reduce fraud, but also to make consumers confident that they can make online purchases safely. Now, we have regulations like PSD2 requiring strong customer authentication on some categories of transactions. And the requirements in PSD2 aim to bring more security to online transactions. And I think that nobody has really a problem with that objective, but the problem is that for merchants and for consumers, it's not only security which is critical, but also the user experience during the purchase process. So we all want security, but at the same time, we love a one-click experience with a minimum of friction. And getting both security and convenience to work together is not always so easy. So since a few months, with the introduction of PSD2 and the need for SCA, we have seen an increased number of transactions that are abandoned by the consumer. Of course, the experience may vary between one consumer to another, but overall, there is now additional friction that is being introduced. And one example is the redirection outside of the merchant domain, which makes the checkout process a bit less intuitive, right? The consumer gets redirected to the bank. For example, they have to enter a password, then they need to access their messaging application on the phone to retrieve a one-time password, and then they get back to the merchant page to finalize the purchase. So when those redirects happen, there is increased friction and then a risk that the consumers do not finalize their purchase. There are other examples, and I think Jason, Lee, and Jonathan might provide a bit more color on this, but more issues potentially where, for example, during an in-app purchase where you have to display the bank's experience might not work always very well, or when consumers, of course, do not have the credentials that are needed to authenticate to their banks, right? So there are a few examples where the need of SCA is bringing some friction. So at the end, it may be frustrating for the merchant who may lose transactions, maybe frustrating for the consumer who starts to purchase and is unable to finalize the checkout. Also, a problem with SCA is that consumers may have to authenticate twice, right? First with the merchant to have access to the account or to the card that is stored on file, and then a second time during the transactions with the bank, and potentially then with different authentication mechanisms. So the question is, can we do something to improve that user experience when we have to perform SCA during online checkout? And we believe that there are opportunities to improve that user experience. First of all, you have some banks already today who are investing in better authentication mechanisms, right? For example, by enabling a banking application with device biometrics. But in parallel of that, we believe that there is also an opportunity for banks to delegate the authentication to qualified merchants or wallet who are already today authenticating consumers to access the account or to access a card that is stored on file. So the opportunity that we have with SCA delegation is not only to deliver convenience with a user experience that is under the control of the merchant and when the consumer stays within the merchant environment during the entire checkout, but at the same time, it delivers security with merchants who implement secure authentication mechanisms to authenticate the consumer. So delegation is not only a merchant benefit or a consumer benefit to improve the user experience, but for banks, it means also that transactions with delegated authentication, when they are correctly implemented, are fully authenticated with SCA and address the PSD2 requirements. And the bank remains also in control of the transaction because they are involved at the very beginning in the initial verification of the consumer. And then during all the subsequent checkouts, they receive information on the authentication results. They may also receive risk data for them to determine whether there is some risk of fraud or not. And they have the final word to approve the transaction. So we believe that there is an opportunity here with delegated authentication. And it is about PSD2. Of course, in Europe, it's very important that we provide good user experience and high levels of security. But even outside of regulated markets, banks who see transactions that are fully authenticated by the merchant with secure authentication mechanisms, with two-factor authentication, are likely to approve transactions with better approval rates and see less fraud overall with those transactions. Now, let's have a look at the main components to implement delegated authentication. And some of the prerequisites may vary from one market to another. So if we focus on Europe for now, there is first a need to have an agreement between the banks and the third-party merchants or wallets to which the authentication is delegated. And that could be under the form of a bilateral agreement, or that could be through a framework that is facilitated, for example, by payment network. So we at MasterCard, for example, provide a multilateral contractual framework that avoids the need for banks to enter into bilateral agreements with all of the merchants. Another prerequisite in Europe is for merchants or wallets to provide an SCA solution that address the PSD2 requirements. And the common expectation is that they will document the SCA solution, they will document the authentication factors and document how the solution is secure and meets PSD2, right? So that the banks get comfortable with the authentication methods that are used by the merchant or by the wallet to authenticate the consumers during the transaction. The next step is to enroll the consumer into the SCA solution. And that means first to implement what we call an identification and verification process. So what does it mean? It means the merchant reach out to the bank to authenticate the consumer, and the bank confirms, yes, this consumer is actually the legitimate owner of the payment account. So it's a one-time authentication that the merchant can decide to do at any time outside of the payment or during the payment. But once the merchant is sure that they have in front of them the right consumer, because the bank confirmed the identity, then the merchant can bind their SCA solution. Let's imagine an SCA solution that is based on device biometrics, right? So binding the device biometrics to the consumer profile and to the payment card that is stored on file with the merchant. So if an SCA solution is using, for example, a consumer device as a possession factor, as one of the two factors to authenticate, there is a device binding that will be created between the payment card and the consumer device, so that now we have a trusted device. So once all those prerequisites are done, then during the checkout, that's where the consumer initiates a transaction and is invited by the merchant to authenticate with the merchant solution. So in my example of device biometrics, the consumer authenticates using a modality like a fingerprint or facial recognition, and that's it, right? The payment is approved. So there is no need to leave the merchant environment anymore in this example. Now, behind the scene, the merchants communicate with the banks or with the payment networks on behalf of the banks, so that the banks have all the information to consider the transaction as fully authenticated and they can approve the transaction. Now, there is some freedom when you implement delegated authentication, as you have multiple SCA solutions that exist and that are very secure. However, we believe that the use of standards provides more benefits. And the first standard that you can see here is FIDO. We will see in the next slide the main benefits of FIDO. But basically, FIDO is all about providing consumers with convenient authentication. For example, a user experience without password, but that is using the biometric capabilities of devices. And it's all about providing this with a high level of security and privacy. The second set of standards are EMVCo standards. And those include EMV3D secure standard, which in the context of delegation can be used to share information on the authentication that was performed by the merchant, but also to share some risk data, which allows to identify any risk of fraud. So for example, based on some information on the consumer device or on the location, you can determine whether the risk that it is not the legitimate consumer. The EMVCo standards also include tokenization standards. So it's used to tokenize the payment card, basically replacing the 16-digit number that you have on your plastic card with a unique token, a token that can be tied to a merchant domain and that protects against account data compromise and account takeover. So we at MasterCard are actively contributing to these standards, as we believe that the combination of strong authentication, FIDO, EMV3DS, and of tokenization is critical to secure the payment credentials that are used on online transaction, while still delivering a great user experience. So let's now focus on the FIDO standard and how FIDO can help us to implement SCA delegation. So we talked already about the convenience of device biometrics that consumers can use from their phone or from their PC. We talked about the security that FIDO brings and the privacy by design. But also FIDO is most importantly a two-factor authentication mechanism, right? It is a possession factor, and it's also a knowledge or inherence depending of what modality you are using to authenticate. What is important as well is that FIDO is interoperable across multiple devices and platforms. So in short, you have today billions of devices that are enabled with FIDO and that potentially can be used for delegated authentication. Then FIDO has a certification process in place, right? We have functional and security evaluation, and the goal is to ensure that all those FIDO products are interoperable and are secure. And finally, I mentioned a little bit earlier about passing authentication results to the bank or to the payment network on their behalf. And so this is something that with FIDO as a standard, the passing this information to the bank or to the payment network is standardized in communication protocols like EMV3DS and possibly other standards in the future. So all the information that I shared during this introduction on delegated authentication and on how FIDO can help is in a white paper that FIDO has published in March of this year. And so it's public documents. We invite you to read it if you're interested for more details about delegation and about the FIDO benefits. So I hand over now to Alain to start this roundtable.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thanks for introducing the subject and setting the scene. Perhaps my first question will be directed to FIS, actually, as you serve quite a large base of merchants. And the question is related to how familiar, how aware are merchants with these SCA obligations in Europe? And do you actually, from your feedback you get from merchants, do you see that as, do they perceive this as an issue? Do merchants have a problem with PSD2?
Sure. Yep. Yeah, I'm happy to answer that, Alan. Obviously, as a major merchant acquirer in Europe, we spend time every day talking to merchants about this. I would say 3DS1 historically, the old 3D secure protocol, had a fairly difficult reputation, right? In a lot of markets, the original implementation was not strong, and consumers would frequently get lost in the purchase process. In some markets, up between 20 and 40% of orders could get lost in the purchase process as consumers didn't understand how to navigate through the 3DS1 process, and therefore would, kind of give up before their order had gone through. So obviously PSD2 has brought in regulation in Europe that requires authentication, requires 3DS, where there isn't an exemption or some transactions can be marked out of scope. And I would say, at the starting point, merchants approach that with some hesitation, knowing what 3DS1 has previously looked like. Now, the good news is that 3DS2 protocol really has brought significant change in the way 3D Secure works. And there is really significant performance improvement in 3DS2 over 3DS1. But all that said, ultimately there is a step in that process that involves the bank at the point of time of purchase to approve the transaction, and there will always be some amount of abandonment potential in that purchase process. So while it's decreased a lot from the historical way we did this, some of that abandonment is still there. And I think the FIDO approach to delegated authentication will really take that a step further in removing ever more abandonment beyond what we're seeing in 3DS2 today.
Thank you, Lee. And Jason at Amazon, do you have a perspective on this this issue introduced by strong customer authentication?
Yeah, I think, abandonment happens even before 3DS, was mandated for PSD2. Abandonment and decline is just an aspect of e-commerce, and shopping cart abandonment is just a pain that all merchants have to live with. But I think overall, MFA, as it relates to SCA, and we'll not really talk about identity access management, but just specific to MFA or PSD2, it has come a long way over the past several years. It is a good way for us to help mitigate, bad actors and sort of that binding mechanism of customers and their issuing banks. It's one of those, I think it gets a bit of a bad rep where people view it as a necessary evil to meet a regulatory, effort from the EBA. But at the same time, it's used to mitigate fraud all over the world. There are chances where there are high-risk transactions that we want to mitigate that fraud. And so we really just have to work on how do we optimize the customer experience? How do we keep the customer in front of it where it doesn't become clunky? It doesn't become a bespoke, process or something that's remarkably, wrought with friction. But rather, find an easy way to authenticate, something that's secure, something that's convenient, and ideally as close to frictionless as possible. Appreciating that's not always the case. And sort of, pardon the pun, but I think the challenge with MFA in general is that right now, it is handled differently across merchants, issuers, services, and devices. It's kind of the Wild West a little bit, depending on, where you're coming from and what you're doing. And so I think the consistency is really what we need to work towards across the entirety of the industry, issuing banks, ACSs, DSs, et cetera, to make sure that we can drive that experience that a customer, when they go from Amazon, for example, to the next merchant and the next merchant, it should look and feel quite similar. But again, being used as a tool to help benefit, protect the customer, not as a means of being an obstruction, I think is the key to success here.
Thank you, Jason. And perhaps another question for FIS. So we've said already that there is some abandonment, there is this concern about friction. And so there could be this interest in SCA delegation. But of course, SCA delegation means that the merchant authenticates. They have to authenticate their customers, and they have to put in place a mechanism to do so. And so the question is, do you see from your discussion with merchants, do you see an appetite for that? Are they looking at doing this themselves, taking on the burden of customer authentication?
Yes, yeah, we have seen, I would say, a fair amount of interest. This is in terms of kind of general availability across the population. We are at the early stages, so the interests that we see are really from the biggest merchants right now that are, I would say, quite technically sophisticated and kind of interested in pushing the boundaries of what can be done technically. But we are seeing interest, and I would expect that to grow over time.
And this would be more in mobile apps or through web UIs on PCs, or
Yeah, predominantly mobile, and even mobile shopping journeys as part of being in a physical store. Yeah. Jonathan, you might have something to add there.
Yeah, I've seen the first sort of round of interest from app-heavy merchants, but they're really excited about the potential on the web, because most e-com's still done on web browsers and on phones. I've been able to get through the browser to the FIDO authenticator on the device, and with the emerging sort of set of laptops that have got authenticators built in, we're hoping, well, I think it's inevitable this will become a ubiquitous way of people logging into things, and then becoming the ubiquitous way for paying for things in the future.
And at Amazon, do you plan also to support multiple devices, or your focus will be on mobile phones? How do you plan to
Yeah, I mean, Amazon has a pretty broad set of devices, right? From our Alexa devices, Kindle e-readers, Fire TV, mobile and browser. So Amazon ecosystem is pretty broad. And many of our customers use multiple or all devices, and finding, good ways to authenticate and keeping you, within the Amazon sort of ecosystem is really helpful. So delegated authentication as a concept is a really interesting sort of feature set to look at. There's lots of ways to solve for it, certainly, as how you delegate that authentication. But I think some of the known performance issues that Jonathan spoke about in the opening, sort of downstream in supply chain, is very much a real thing that merchants deal with. And so delegating that authentication can help alleviate some of those concerns. So it's certainly something of interest, I think, for all large merchants.
Okay, thank you, Jason. Turning to Jonathan from MasterCard. So as you pointed out in your presentation, SCA delegation requires an agreement of the merchant or that third party with the bank. And that would be either a bilateral agreement, which certainly will not scale, or it could be a framework agreement. And you started alluding to the fact that MasterCard can help here. So could you elaborate more on how a MasterCard can help scale delegated authentication?
Yeah. So indeed, the goal is to scale this delegated authentication concept. And one obstacle, as you said, is the need in Europe for agreements. So if you want to avoid the need to set up bilateral agreements between everyone, which would take forever, we are offering a multilateral contractual framework that avoids that need of bilateral agreement between the banks and the merchants or digital wallets, and also that define set of rules to implement delegated authentication. So create an opportunity for merchants to offer SCA solutions that meet PSD2 requirements, and for banks to delegate their authentication to those qualified merchants, and therefore, hopefully, to create a scale of delegated authentication in the European market.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. Maybe I'll come back to this impact on merchants if they were to do this themselves. And so clearly this is in the reach of a large retailer like Amazon, but a lot of these online retailers, they're small. And so my question to FIS is, do you propose to help, and how would you help merchants implement SCA delegation? And more particularly, do you see FIDO as being of help to implement? Lee, maybe?
Yeah, I think it's certainly something we're thinking about. As I had alluded to earlier, I think in terms of the rollout, we are kind of in early stages, and so the focus for now is really on the major merchants. but that is, I think, the kind of interesting long-term view, right? Of how do we get past then that handful of big tech-savvy merchants to kind of the mid-market and the SMB populations, and is there a place for this in those type of populations? So I think we'll have to see how things evolve over the next year or so. Jonathan, what's your opinion?
Yeah, I think it's got to, I mean, for the smaller merchants, it's got to be super easy to implement, and at the moment it's fairly hard. So any way that the FIDO can work to make it easier to implement on their side, that would be great.
Well, certainly the standardization aspect and the native availability in browsers will be of help, don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely.
Back to Jonathan from MasterCard. So we've just discussed helping merchants, but banks will probably need some help as well, I guess. And so do you see FIDO as being an authentication standard which will help put in place delegated authentication?
Yeah, I think we saw in the intro the benefits of FIDO, right? With the high level of security and privacy. And we can basically offer with FIDO a level of security that is similar to the bank's own mechanisms, right? And even some banks are using FIDO today in their own application. So I think there is an opportunity with FIDO to get more and more banks to adopt delegated authentication. And because of that, security level, and also when you use device biometrics on the device, the authentication is performed locally on the device, so there is no need to store password in a merchant database, etc. So I think it's an opportunity to provide more confidence to issuers to delegate their authentication. Now, doesn't mean that FIDO is the only secure mechanism, but it's probably easier for an issuer to rely on an approach that is based on standards than to review the security of individual SCA mechanisms provided by each merchant, right? They may do this with the top merchants, but might not be very scalable. So the use of FIDO can help to get issuers more confident, but also to delegate to more and more merchants, in our opinion.
Okay. Perhaps before we hand over to the audience for their questions, just maybe to finish on where do you see the benefits of using FIDO and what are the strong points of using FIDO for delegated authentication? Maybe Jason from Amazon could try and answer the question.
Sure. So I think the attractive nature of FIDO is its open standards and will help drive consistency. And I think, as the panel has discussed a couple of times, there's a lot of ways to solve two-factor and multi-factor authentication. There's as many ways to solve it. And I think finding the right approach that everyone would start to adopt is really going to be key there. Because I think the challenge that we have today in the industry, you've got different types of OTP and SMS, you've got push notification, you've got native bank apps for authentication. There's a lot of different ways to go, and based on the merchant and the bank, the permutations and the cardinality of that is tremendous. So I'm really looking forward to seeing, can FIDO drive that standardization? Getting the same level of buy-in from all the industry players, similar to EMVCo, of having the technical standards, fit for purpose, and really creating that one-stop shop for all things, sort of FIDO or biometric authentication. I think will be very helpful. But the key will be is just making sure it's consistent, making sure interoperability is there, and standardization. Standing up any new protocol in a large enterprise is time-consuming and expensive. And so you don't want to do it over and over if you can avoid it. So I think as long as FIDO can offer that interoperability, the standardization, certification programs, things of that nature, I think that'll go a long way to drive that consistency across the payments industry.
Yeah, and ideally, I think that what we did in the physical world, right, with the terminals, when we have bring the chip and pin technology, right, to have interoperability and security, that could be a nice way to bring that same level of security and interoperability now for online transactions by relying on a standard like FIDO.
Thank you. FIS, what would be your views on the strong points of FIDO for delegated authentication?
Yeah, I'd agree with everything that's been said already. I mean, I think the the level of security and also, the potential availability across such a wide breadth of devices is really important. And I think, similar to the comments from Amazon, obviously, when we look at investing money and building new products and, sharing them out across the vast FIS merchant base, we want things that are standardized and interoperable. And I think that will be very important in our long-term decisions. Jonathan?
Yeah, and I think with the other benefit of FIDO is the privacy protection. So, different countries, as you roll out globally, have different privacy laws, and having confidence that the biometric templates and things never leave the device is fantastic. And also the kind of forward support. So once you build your FIDO server, as people build out new authenticators, like what's next, earlobe detection, it'll be built-in support, and then having that FIDO do the security evaluation, so banks can have confidence that the new authenticator is good enough for payments. It's going to be a real step forward.
Thank you. Well, thank you all. I think it's time now to take a few questions from the audience. So please, let's look at that.